Hello folks, this is Miss McFadden and I have provided this lecture video for you to watch. Not only my kids at Centennial, but also Miss Innes's kids at Lebanon Trail High School, because that way you can take notes at your leisure. We are covering Period 2 and Period 3, the growth of trade routes. And as you guys already know, trade routes are so important to the study of world history. And there's an entire key concept dedicated to it. Is key concept 2.3. Now, if you look over here, it says role of geography. Very important, guys. The climate, okay, especially in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, we're going to see climate plays a big role. Topography, whether it's deserts, mountains, seas, at the very least, it provides different minerals and plants, and that determines a lot of what is traded. Location of trade routes, of course, typical trade goods, and the ethnicity of the people involved also makes a difference. In addition, new technologies are huge for trade routes, and that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more. Moving forward, I will say no that monsoon winds are important, especially for the Indian Ocean Trade Network. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so what was traded or what was exchanged on trade routes? Well, you have the good, the bad, the ugly. Okay, trade goods, crops, domesticated animals, they're pretty good. Exchange of people, not so bad unless one group of people wanted to attack another group of people. That could be bad. Technology, religious, and cultural beliefs, well, it depends who you ask, whether that's good or not. And then, of course, disease pathogens. That's definitely the ugly. Okay, all of this were exchanges that developed along the trade networks. Now, trade networks, we don't just say trade, we say exchanges for that reason, because there's more than goods being exchanged, right? There's religions, languages, culture, so much. Some of the things to keep in mind are the crops, okay, that spread because of trade routes, of course the diseases, and religious traditions and how they were transformed as they spread. So demand for goods instigates trade. Guys, let's clarify. Demand for luxury goods, okay? If you live in Europe and you don't have access to spices, spices now become luxury goods for you, okay? If you don't have access to salt, salt becomes a luxury good because it's not something you can easily get. But luxury goods were what really instigated trade. And so let's look at Inner Eurasia pastoralists, your Mongols or your Xiongnu. What did they want from Eurasian agriculturalists? Well, they wanted manufactured goods, probably. But then what could the Eurasian agriculturalists want from the pastoralists? Technology. Pastoralists had the time for technology. They also had horses and other domesticatable animals. So there was a back and forth trade exchange going on there. Salt was very important, believe it or not. That was the only spice available to many people around the world. Merchants were taking great risks, guys, to make great profits, and they had to go a long distance to make those profits. So Romans were buying silk from China. Merchants transported the silk and other goods for a couple hundred miles, and then they traded it to the next group, and that's how they were paid for their part. Now, this indirect web of connections, you have to keep in mind the goods were relayed from town to town. The merchant who set out in Chang'an was not the merchant who wound up in Constantinople. Okay, there were many merchants along the way, intermediaries as they call them. But this trade is what allowed merchants to become more contributing members of society and higher up in society. Over here, what I would like to mention to you is, you notice it's Silk Roads, not the road. Normally we say Silk Road, really it's many different roads, and you could see that right here. And this was the most extensive east-west land-based trade. Okay, so this was the biggest, bar none, in that time period. Okay, it was named for silk, which was the most valued product that actually was exchanged. Spices were also exchanged on it. Animals were also exchanged on it. But silk is obviously the most luxurious, so hence the name. All right, so who wanted silk? Well, you know, people with money who wanted silk, the elite. It also was used in Buddhism and Christianity, in churches and in monasteries, so it had a high religious value. There were some other items that were also traded. You should be familiar of the directional trade that took place on the Silk Road and what were the items traded. Some really important ones that you're going to keep seeing: camel, horses, spices, rice, cotton, gold. Those are some of the very important products, but so was amber and olive oil and glass, sandalwood. Okay, so just be familiar with this. Now, interestingly, this exchange of grains and fabrics and whatnot actually changed a lot of things in Eurasia, and it really changed it for the poor people, the farmers, okay? The farmers who used to grow whatever food they needed to survive now stopped doing that. They stopped farming or doing subsistence farming, and instead they started growing crops that they could take to market and make more money. So you had little farmers, Chinese farmers, who were, maybe growing some rice and growing some other vegetables, and now suddenly they stopped doing that and they just stopped growing. They just started growing rice and nothing else, or they start harvesting silk and nothing else. So they can take it to market, make more money, and then go buy the subsistence food that they need. So yes, the Silk Roads encouraged specialization, but that also meant local societies could no longer just grow what they needed. They had to be involved in a greater trade network. The Qanat system is really important to know. It is a very innovative way of irrigation, especially in the desert where it goes down to the water table and through little holes in the ground, it transports the water up to the desert. Basically, that allowed deserts to become land that they could grow things on. Okay, so this spread into Southwest Asia. Well, that's the Middle East, right? That's your Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq and those areas. And so it actually allowed some crops from Southeast Asia, like cotton and sugar, to now be grown in the Middle East. Okay, so we know that the trade networks, trade routes actually allowed for the growth of large and powerful empires. You guys saw that with Rome. You saw it with Persia. You saw it with the Mauryan Gupta dynasty. You saw it with Aksum and Meroe. You saw it with Teotihuacan and with the Mayans. Okay, trade routes allow for empires to grow. Merchants and missionaries are the ones who are taking not only goods, but cultural beliefs with them. So Buddhism spread from India to China, Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan, and it changed as it spread. So once Buddhism got to China, it became Mahayana Buddhism. When it got to Japan, it became Zen Buddhism. There were other trade routes as well. There were the tea and horse caravan roads. They were not as well known as the Silk Road, but they were still very important. I'm not going to go over this too much. You guys know, right, that pandemic diseases spread over the Silk Roads and other trade networks as well, and it killed urban populations, and they say it's a key reason for the fall of the Han Empire. That's the ugly we talked about earlier. All right, Trans-Saharan trade route. Guys, this really spread with the growth of Islam and the introduction of camels. Okay, what does the Sahara have, or sub-Saharan area have, that others wanted? It had gold, it had salt, it had ivory, it had slaves. And yes, slavery started. Slaves from Africa were taken way before the transatlantic slave route occurred in, the 1400s, 1500s. So I already mentioned the gold, the salt, the slaves. So up in the coastal areas of Africa, it was very rich in vegetation. And so a lot of that vegetation would then come down here, and the people would get the gold, the salt, and the slaves and take them up to the north. Something to keep in mind, yokes, saddles, and stirrups were new technologies that made the use of domesticated pack animals even more attractive for long distance trade. So horses, oxen, camels, they could now travel longer routes. And again, the camel being so important for the trans-Saharan route. All right, so this is your Indian Ocean Trade Network. A couple of things I want you to notice. The Silk Roads tied into the Indian Ocean Trade Network. It also tied into the Mediterranean Sea. None of these routes were sufficient and on their own. Okay, they were connected to each other. Now, the Indian Ocean Trade Network was the largest sea trading network in the world up until the transatlantic trade opened in the 1400s with the Europeans going to the Americas. It was also a major conveyor of Buddhism from South Asia into East and Southeast Asia, and then it also spread Islam to Africa and other places, Africa as well as, I should say, Indonesia. And a lot of the items that were traded were more mass-produced items or bigger, bulkier items. You're not going to ship lumber on the Silk Roads because how much lumber can a camel carry? But on a ship, you can carry a lot more lumber. So some of the bulkier items went on the Indian Ocean trade route. I also want to point out, you see Somalia here? These were the Swahili states. And these developed as a direct effect of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Merchants all the way from China and India and Arabia came and settled in the Swahili states over here that did the trading. And Swahili is a combination of Bantu and Arabic. Okay. All right, I mentioned monsoon winds before. Very important to know, guys. These monsoon winds would blow from the East African coast towards South Asia in the summer and back the other direction in the winter. It was a natural cloth. You knew what to expect. So the merchants timed their trips based on that, and that is what made the Indian Ocean Trade Network so attractive to merchants, because they knew exactly which direction they had to go and when they needed to come back. These trading ships called dhows were also very helpful. They worked really well with the monsoon winds because they used these triangular lateen sails to maneuver the small boats that were used for trading. The Arabs became really good at shipbuilding and navigational skills. In fact, the Europeans, a lot of the knowledge they gained later came from the Arabs. One thing to note with the Indian Ocean Trade Network is Eurasians used it and it was free. Europeans did not use it. It was not dominated by them until the 1400s, 1500s, when the Europeans came in and did not want anyone else to use that trade network. All right, folks, I do want to point out that Constantinople was located basically at the junction of the Black Sea trade network, the Mediterranean trade network, Silk Roads, and indirectly the Indian Ocean trade network. And that is what made Constantinople so rich for so long. And that is another reason why the Byzantium Empire lasted for 1,000 years. Okay, last but not least, the American trade routes. Keep in mind, the trade was much smaller here than anywhere else for a few different reasons. First of all, not as many people. They didn't have the large domesticatable animals. They had llamas and alpacas and small dogs that didn't serve the purpose very well. So they had humans. Humans would put a lot of the goods on their back and they would run to the next city or, 3 cities down and then trade the goods and give it to the next person who would then run. So essentially it was a relay trade. The other thing to keep in mind is that the jungle terrain in Panama, which connects the North and Central America with South America, was so narrow and dense, it was hard to get through. Was it impossible? No, because obviously corn developed in Mesoamerica and somehow spread south. And some manufactured goods did too, but it was very, very limited. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. Hopefully you got something valuable out of it. Make sure you take copious notes and be prepared for any check or quiz that is coming your way based on this information. Thanks and have a good weekend.